very ordinary and rather uneventful history of the pencil. Good evening and welcome. Today, we will be discussing the pencil, not the pen, not the stylus, and certainly not the quill. No, tonight we are committing to the modest pencil, which, while unremarkable in appearance, has a surprisingly long history. This history is not particularly exciting, nor does it involve thrilling battles, conspiracies, or great romances. Instead, it is a history of mining, of woodcutting, of small inventions made incrementally over centuries, and of small decisions that led to the writing implement most of us have forgotten exists in the age of the keyboard. Now, you may already be familiar with the pencil. It is usually yellow, sometimes orange, occasionally green. It's made of wood, most often cedar, though sometimes other varieties. Inside is not, as many children once believed, lead, but rather graphite, mixed with clay, formed into a cylinder, and encased for convenient use. The pencil can be sharpened to a point, worn down, and sharpened again. Unlike the pen, it does not run out of ink, but instead shortens imperceptibly, millimeter by millimeter, until one day becomes a stub, too small to hold comfortably. But let us not get ahead of ourselves. The discovery of graphite. Our story begins not in a bustling city, nor a famed university, but in the rather damp and unremarkable hills of Borrowdale, in Cumbria, England, around the year 1564, though some argue for 1565, and a few for as early as 1550. Local shepherds discovered a curious substance lodged in the ground. It was dark, left a mark when rubbed against surfaces, and, importantly for the shepherds, it was useful for marking sheep. This material, initially mistaken for lead, was in fact graphite. At the time, the term plumbago was often used, derived from the Latin word for lead. The confusion persisted for centuries, and the pencil is still occasionally referred to inaccurately as lead pencil. The Borrowdale deposit of graphite was unusually pure, dense, and solid. This particular quality allowed it to be sawn into sticks that could, in turn, be wrapped in string or encased in wood. Other sources of graphite existed in the world, of course, but most were powdery, requiring different methods of handling. It was this accident of geography, a deposit of pure, solid graphite in a remote part of England, that set into motion the history of the modern pencil. Now, you may be wondering, why Borrowdale? Why graphite there and not elsewhere? To answer this question would involve a lengthy diversion into geology, which we shall now attempt, though I warn you, the details are both dry and prone to monotony. Graphite forms under conditions of high pressure and temperature, usually from carbon-rich materials subjected to metamorphism. In the case of Borrowdale, it is believed that ancient sediments, rich in organic matter, were buried, heated, and compressed over millions of years during the formation of the Lake District's mountainous terrain. Volcanic activity contributed additional pressure and heat, producing the unusual lump-like graphite unique to that location. The geological timescale for this formation stretches not for centuries, nor even millennia, but hundreds of millions of years. Rocks shifted, mountains rose, glaciers scraped the land, and yet the graphite remained, patiently waiting for some unsuspecting shepherd to stumble upon it and think, this will do nicely for marking my sheep. Early pencils and their use. Once graphite was discovered, it was not long before people began experimenting with its potential uses. In addition to marking sheep, it was tried for writing and drawing. Wrapped in string or sheepskin, these early pencils were functional but somewhat messy. The graphite would stain the fingers. It would crumble if not carefully handled. Still, it worked. And in an age when quills had to be dipped frequently in ink, and ink itself was prone to smudging, the pencil provided a certain convenience. It was erasable too, which quill and ink were decidedly not. This erasability was at first seen as a flaw. Why use a writing tool that could so easily be undone, but eventually became one of the pencil's defining features? By the late 16th century, the usefulness of the Borrowdale graphite had spread beyond shepherds. Artisans, scribes, and artists found it suitable for sketching. Military officials saw its potential for marking maps. Graphite was valuable enough that the mines at Borrowdale came under the protection of the Crown. Armed guards were stationed to prevent theft, and strict regulations were put in place for its extraction. This brings us to the rather unexciting subject of mining law in Tudor England. Mining operations were tightly controlled, often leased by the Crown to entrepreneurs who promised a share of the profits. The Borrowdale mine was no different. Men laboured in dark, damp conditions, cutting blocks of graphite and hauling them to the surface. The blocks were sawn into sticks, then wrapped or encased. The process was laborious, but demand was steady. And so, throughout the late 16th and 17th centuries, the pencil began its slow march into common use. A brief diversion into measurement. Before we continue, it may be helpful to pause and consider the dimensions of these early pencils. Records suggest that sticks of graphite were typically cut to lengths of 5 to 8 inches and widths of perhaps half an inch. The thickness varied depending on the block of graphite available. These measurements, while seemingly trivial, remind us that even the smallest details of material culture are shaped by the limitations of natural resources and the tools available to process them. One must imagine a shepherd holding such a crude stick, wrapped perhaps in a bit of twine, and marking the wool of his flock. Not the neat hexagonal yellow pencils we know today, but rather lumpy, fragile rods of stone. Early manufacturing and evolution of the pencil, 17th to 19th centuries. By the 18th century, the pencil had begun to evolve in ways that were incremental, meticulous, and for some, remarkably dull. In France, artisans experimented with methods to encase the graphite in wood more securely. They noticed that raw sticks of graphite were prone to breakage during transport, handling, or even light writing. To address this, they carefully carved grooves into wooden slats, placed the graphite within, and glued another slat on top. Result, while aesthetically pleasing in a restrained, unassuming way, greatly improved usability. It was around this time, in 1795, that Nicolas Jacques Conté, a French engineer, invented a technique that would define modern pencil manufacture. Conté mixed powdered graphite with clay and then fired the mixture in a kiln. The ratio of clay to graphite was critical. More clay produced a harder, lighter-colored pencil, suitable for fine lines and technical drawings, whereas less clay resulted in a softer, darker pencil, ideal for artistic sketches. This period also marked the beginning of pencils with standardized grading. The letters H and B, denoting hardness and blackness, began to appear, though not universally at first. Pencils could range from 9H, extremely hard and barely visible on paper, to 9B, very soft and dark. In between, there were countless gradations, all designed to suit the preferences of scribes, engineers, artists, and anyone with the patience to consider the subtle differences in pencil density and mark making. The industrialization of pencil production. Meanwhile, pencil production, once a cottage industry practiced by a handful of skilled artisans, began to industrialize. Factories emerged in Germany, where high-quality cedar and other softwoods were readily available. German manufacturers developed machinery to cut slats, shape them, and drill precise grooves for graphite insertion. They perfected gluing techniques, allowing pencils to emerge from the factory in neat, uniform rows, each virtually identical to the last. In England, pencil production was slower to industrialize, but demand steadily increased. Schools required pencils for students, offices for clerks, and artists for preparatory sketches. Consequently, English manufacturers had to balance quality and quantity. Some experimented with alternative woods, cheaper production methods, and the early use of erasers, though attaching an eraser would not become common until the mid-19th century. Factories employed hundreds of workers, each assigned to narrow, repetitive tasks. One worker would cut wood into slats, another would drill grooves, another would insert the graphite, another would glue and press the slats together. Still others painted, labeled, and boxed the finished pencils. Each step, though minor in isolation, contributed to the slow, steady rise of the pencil as an everyday object. Pencils in daily life, 18th to 19th century. By the early 19th century, pencils were common in Europe and spreading across the Atlantic to North America. They are found in schools, offices, and homes. The American market was growing, but it remained largely dependent on imported graphite and techniques refined in Europe. In the classroom, pencils replaced the slate and chalk that had dominated earlier centuries. Students could write more cleanly, erase errors, and avoid the dust associated with chalk. In offices, pencils allowed clerks to record transactions, take notes, and correct mistakes without blotting or smudging ink. Artists appreciated pencils for preliminary sketches, shading studies, and layouts. It is worth noting the rather mundane fact that pencils, at this time, were not uniformly hexagonal. Many were round, and some were oval. The hexagonal pencil, which reduces rolling and improves grip, would eventually become standard, but it was not universally adopted until the late 19th century. The introduction of erasers. The history of the eraser, too, is quietly fascinating. Before the mid-19th century, correcting pencil marks required breadcrumbs, wax, or damp cloth. In 1770, Edward Nairn, an English engineer, discovered that natural rubber could remove pencil marks cleanly. The process of vulcanization, developed by Charles Goodyear in 1839, allowed rubber erasers to become more durable, less sticky, and attachable to pencils. Thus, by the mid-19th century, the pencil with attached eraser emerged. It was a modest innovation, but one that greatly improved convenience. Children, students, and office workers could write and correct errors without interrupting their work. The eraser became a small but essential companion to the humble pencil. The social and economic context of pencils. During this period, pencils were not considered luxury items, yet they were not ubiquitous either. They were functional tools, relatively affordable, but still objects of careful use. Records from European schools indicate that children were encouraged to handle pencils cautiously, Excessive sharpening or chewing was discouraged. Office supply catalogues listed pencils alongside ink, blotting paper, and quills as part of a modest, practical stationery collection. Factories expanded, but pencil production remained a labor-intensive endeavor. Each pencil, though simple, required precise cuts, careful shaping, proper alignment of graphite, and even occasionally hand finishing. It was an unglamorous trade, yet essential to the functioning of schools, offices, and artistic workshops. Global pencil trade, brands, and anecdotes, 19th to 20th century. By the mid-19th century, the pencil had become a global commodity. Europe remained the hub of high-quality production. Germany, in particular, emerged as the leading manufacturer of pencils thanks to abundant softwoods, skilled labor, and perfected techniques of graphite insertion and slat gluing. Factories in Nuremberg, Fürth, and later Munich produced pencils in enormous quantities, supplying not only Europe, but also markets across the Atlantic. German pencils and standardization. German manufacturers refined pencil grading systems. The letters H and B, used to denote hardness and blackness, became widely adopted, while some manufacturers insisted on fine gradations, 2H, 3H, HB, F, 2B, 3B. Others preferred simpler schemes. Each pencil was carefully tested for smoothness, consistency of graphite, and uniformity of color. Workers, often children or young apprentices, measured pencils individually, noting deviations from standardized length, width, and roundness. The production of pencils in Germany also included quality control regarding wood. Cedar was highly prized for its softness, aroma, and ease of sharpening. In contrast, less expensive woods, such as basswood or juniper, were used for pencils destined for schools or mass markets. Even the scent of cedar became a minor marketing point. A freshly sharpened pencil had a pleasant aroma, subtly signaling quality to the buyer. Pencils in the United States. In the United States, the pencil industry initially relied on European imports. However, by the mid-19th century, domestic manufacturing began to grow. Companies like Eberhard Faber and the American Lead Pencil Company, which later became Dixon Ticonderoga, standardized production for American classrooms and offices. American pencils were often painted in solid colors: black, green, red, and eventually yellow. The yellow pencil, which became popular in the 1890s, was marketed as high quality and distinctive. Manufacturers wanted to stand out in a crowded market, and yellow pencils were visually striking when displayed in rows in stationery stores. Pencils in daily life. By this time, pencils were found in nearly every household, schoolroom, and office. They were used to take notes, draft letters, draw plans, and sketch ideas. Unlike pens, pencils did not require ink, which could spill or smudge. Unlike quills, pencils did not need repeated sharpening of a tip with a knife. Unlike modern ballpoints, pencils could be erased. In classrooms, children were instructed in proper pencil etiquette. Chewing on pencils was discouraged, as it damaged both the wood and the graphite. Sharpening was to be done carefully, with attention to the angle of the point and the evenness of the wood slats. A well-sharpened pencil, it was noted, can make a significant difference in the quality of handwriting and the evenness of sketching lines. Pencils. During conflict. Interestingly, even the pencil was not immune to the disruptions of war. During World War I and World War II, pencil production faced material shortages. graphite was diverted to military applications, and wood supplies were restricted. Manufacturers experimented with recycled wood, synthetic graphite, and alternative timbers. In some cases, entire factories were repurposed for war production, and pencil production slowed. Civilians and schools had to make do with lower quality pencils. These wartime pencils were sometimes poorly balanced, prone to breakage, and painted in dull or utilitarian colors, such as gray or brown. The rise of mechanical pencils. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, mechanical pencils began to appear. These were refillable, often using thin rods of graphite that could be advanced by twisting or clicking mechanisms. While initially considered a novelty, mechanical pencils offered several advantages: uniform line thickness, no need for constant sharpening, and the convenience of portability. Mechanical pencils were more expensive than traditional pencils, however, and were often marketed to engineers, draftsmen, and other professionals who valued precision. The early mechanical pencils were sometimes made of metal, occasionally of celluloid, and required careful maintenance to avoid jams or breakage of the graphite core. Anecdotes and curiosities. Though seemingly mundane, the history of pencils is dotted with small, quietly interesting anecdotes. For example, thefts of Borrowdale graphite in the 16th and 17th centuries were treated as serious crimes. Armed guards patrolled the mines, and there are records of men being imprisoned for attempting to smuggle out even small lumps of graphite. Another curiosity involves pencil shortages. In the 19th century, a factory in Germany reportedly ran out of a particular grade of graphite, delaying shipment to schools in England. Students and teachers had to improvise with softer or harder pencils, which subtly affected handwriting and sketching practices. Even marketing campaigns became slightly elaborate, if subtly so. Pencil companies advertised pencils as smooth, long-lasting, and easy to erase. Some even suggested that the pencils could improve handwriting or increase one's artistic skill, though such claims were rarely verified. The pencil in the modern world. Late 20th century, present. By the latter half of the 20th century, pencils had settled into their quiet, dependable role in human society, while pens, ballpoints, and eventually computers began to dominate writing and drawing. Pencils remained in classrooms, offices, art studios, and homes. They were modest, unobtrusive tools, rarely praised, seldom celebrated, yet continually useful. The persistence of traditional pencils. Even as technology advanced, the traditional wooden pencil remained in use. Children in schools sharpened pencils carefully, mindful of not wasting the graphite. Office clerks kept pencils in drawers for forms, calculations, and notes that might later need erasing. Artists continued to use pencils for preliminary sketches, shading studies, and detailed drawings. It is worth noting that the pencil, despite its simplicity, remains subject to refinement. Manufacturers experimented with different types of wood, including sustainable alternatives. Cedar, once the gold standard, gave way to other softwoods and composites, sometimes chosen for cost efficiency, sometimes for environmental concerns. Graphite composition was adjusted to achieve particular hardness or smoothness. Paints, erasers, ferrules, and stamping techniques evolved gradually, often unnoticed by the general user. Colored pencils. The mid-20th century also saw the rise of colored pencils. These differed from graphite pencils in that pigments, waxes, and binders replaced graphite and clay. Colored pencils allowed children, artists, and hobbyists to create images with a range of hues, subtle shading, and texture. Companies such as Crayola, Caran d'Ache, and Prismacolor became prominent. Each brand had slightly different formulations, sometimes softer, sometimes harder, some more vibrant, some more blendable. For the user, these differences were often imperceptible at first, but could be discerned with careful attention over time. Colored pencils, like graphite pencils, required sharpening, proper storage, and occasional careful examination for breakage. They were, fundamentally, pencils, instruments requiring patience, dexterity, and repetitive use. Mechanical and technical pencils. Mechanical pencils continued to develop. By the late 20th century, they were widely used in technical professions, engineering, and art. Some used thin rods of graphite. Others incorporated leads of varying hardness, similar to the HB grading of traditional pencils. The mechanisms themselves became slightly more reliable. Twisting, clicking, or sliding mechanisms allowed for smoother advancement of graphite cores. Some mechanical pencils were made of plastic, some metal, some a combination. They required occasional maintenance, cleaning, replacement of worn parts, and insertion of new leads. These pencils were precise, convenient, and consistent, though they lacked the tactile satisfaction of sharpening a wooden pencil by hand. Nevertheless, their popularity grew steadily, particularly among students preparing for exams or engineers producing detailed schematics. Pencils in the digital age. Entering the 21st century, pencils faced the advent of digital tools. Keyboards, styluses, tablets, and software applications began to replace much traditional writing and drawing. Yet, pencils persisted. They were simple, portable, and reliable. No batteries, no software updates, no risk of crashing. Interestingly, this persistence can be seen as a testament to the pencil's design. Over hundreds of years, small incremental improvements, sharpening methods, clay graphite ratios, wood selection, erasers, had produced a remarkably robust tool. Even in the age of tablets and styluses, pencils remained functional, accessible, and, importantly, quiet. The cultural role of the pencil. Although it is unremarkable, the pencil has subtly influenced culture. Schools and classrooms depend on pencils for basic literacy. Artists use them to sketch preliminary ideas. Even in offices dominated by computers, pencils are kept on desks, ready for a quick note or a temporary mark. Pencils have also appeared in literature, humor, and art as symbols of patience, diligence, and the ordinary. Their quiet presence reminds us of steady labor, slow improvement, and incremental progress. Unlike dramatic inventions that revolutionized society overnight, pencils evolved gradually, with countless minor refinements over centuries. The pencil today. Today, pencils are manufactured worldwide. Brands continue to differentiate themselves based on wood type, graphite quality, eraser durability, shape, paint, and price. Some pencils are luxury items, carefully crafted, engraved, or made of exotic woods. Most remain utilitarian, simple, functional, unadorned. They are sold in boxes of 12 or 24 in classrooms, stationery stores, and online marketplaces. Some come with erasers, some without. Some are hexagonal, some round, some triangular for ergonomic purposes. Regardless, the pencil continues to perform its simple task, making marks on paper, erasing mistakes, and patiently shortening over time. And so we arrive at the present day. The pencil has endured hundreds of years of modest innovation, unremarkable progress, and quiet use. It has survived wars, industrial changes, technological revolutions, and shifts in education. Its history is slow, deliberate, and incremental. If you are still awake, imagine holding a pencil. Feel its cylindrical body between your fingers. Hear the faint scratch of graphite against paper. Watch as it shortens, millimeter by millimeter, as you write, draw, or trace shapes. Notice the scent of cedar, the faint imprint of the eraser, the muted colors of the paint. The pencil is ordinary, it is quiet, it is steady, and in that steadiness, it is perfectly suited to lull you into sleep. Good night.